Have you ever opened up your podcast dashboard, looked at your downloads, and immediately judged whether or not your show was a success? Maybe you thought, wow, this episode did great. Or maybe the opposite happened. You looked through the numbers and thought, why is no one listening? I see this happen all the time with podcasters, especially entrepreneurs and business owners who start a podcast as part of their marketing strategy. They pour their time into recording an episode, they publish it, and then they check their stats. And suddenly, those numbers start telling a story inside their head. Sometimes that story is encouraging, and a lot of times it's discouraging. But here's the problem. Most podcasters don't actually understand what their statistics mean. And when you misunderstand the data, you start making bad decisions. You start doubting your podcast, you start comparing yourself to other shows, and sometimes you stop podcasting altogether. I recently read an article from Pod News breaking down how podcast statistics actually work, and it confirmed everything that I've been telling my clients for years. Podcast analytics are not as straightforward as they seem. So today, I want to walk you through what your podcast stats are really telling you, what they're not telling you, and how entrepreneurs should actually evaluate whether their podcast is working. Because the numbers you think matter most might not be the numbers that actually grow your business. Welcome to Rocky Mountain Marketing. I'm your host, Katie Brinkley. Join us as we dive deep with the world's leading digital marketing experts every single Tuesday. It's all about giving you the strategies that are working right now, directly from those who are making an impact. With my 20 years of experience, I'm here to help you navigate the world of digital marketing. Whether you're looking to sharpen your skills or transform your business, you're in the right place. Let's get started on today's journey to success. Let's start with the number everyone looks at first. Downloads. Whether you log into your podcast hosting platform, downloads are usually the first thing that you see. And it's easy to assume that downloads equal listeners. But that's not what a download actually means. A download simply means that the audio file was delivered to a device. That's it. It doesn't guarantee that someone actually listened to the episode. In fact, many podcast apps automatically download episodes from shows that people follow, which means that your episode could technically be downloaded and yet never played. Now, that doesn't mean that downloads are useless. They still give you an idea of reach, but they don't tell you the full story about engagement. And this is where so many podcasters start to spiral. They think that if their numbers are low, their podcast isn't working. But they're judging the show based on a metric that doesn't actually measure listening behavior. Another reason why podcast statistics can actually feel frustrating is because the data comes from multiple places. Your hosting platform collects one set of numbers, Spotify collects another, Apple Podcasts has its own analytics, and each of those platforms measure things a little bit differently. Your host typically shows downloads across all listening apps, but platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts can sometimes show deeper behavior. Things like how long someone listened, where they stopped listening, or whether they followed your show. The tricky part is that those insights only apply to listeners using that specific app, which means no single dashboard shows the complete picture. Frustrating, right? So think of your podcast analytics like puzzle pieces. Each platform gives you a part of the story, but you have to take a step back and look at the bigger pattern. And you're probably saying, okay, so if the downloads don't tell the full story, what should podcasters actually be paying attention to? There are 3 things that I encourage my clients to watch more closely. The very first thing is listener retention. Retention tells you how long people stay with your episode. And this metric is incredibly important because it tells you whether or not your content is keeping people engaged. If listeners drop off quickly, that's usually a sign that your intro needs work. And this is why I always emphasize the importance of starting with a strong hook. Your listener needs to know immediately why this episode matters to them. The second metric that matters is completion rate. So do people finish the episode? If listeners stay all the way through your content, that is a huge indicator that your topic is resonating. It means your episode delivered value. And last but not least, there is subscriber growth. When someone subscribes to your podcast, they're choosing to hear from you again. They want more of your insights, more of your perspective. And that is incredibly powerful if you're using your podcast as part of your marketing strategy, because every subscriber is essentially a warm lead. They've invited you into their headphones, into their car every single week. And that builds trust in a way very few marketing channels can. There's one belief that's causing a ton of frustration more than anything else in podcasting. And it's the idea that you need thousands of listeners to have a successful show. That simply isn't true. The average podcast episode actually gets fewer than 30 listens. And that surprises a ton of people because when we think about podcasts, we tend to think about the biggest shows, the ones with massive audiences. But those shows are the exception. Most podcasts have relatively small audiences, and that's not a bad thing because podcasting isn't about reaching everyone. It's about reaching the right people. If 50 of your ideal clients listen to your podcast every week, that is incredibly valuable. Those listeners are spending real time with you. They're hearing your ideas. They're learning from your expertise. By the time they reach out to work with you, they already trust you. And that right there is the real power of podcasting. That's not just content. That is relationship building. So instead of obsessing over downloads, I encourage all you podcasters to ask better questions. Which episodes have been sparking conversations? Which topics lead to messages, emails, or client inquiries? Which episodes are getting shared? Which ones resonate enough that someone tells a friend about them? Your analytics are giving you clues about what your audience cares about. And when you start paying attention to those patterns, they can guide your entire content strategy. Maybe your audience loves episodes where you break down a marketing trend. Maybe storytelling episodes resonate more. Maybe shorter episodes keep listeners engaged longer. These insights are incredibly valuable because they help you create content that your audience actually wants. And when you do that consistently, your podcast becomes one of the most powerful marketing tools in your business. So think about how most people consume content today. They scroll past social media posts in seconds. They skim blog articles. They jump from video to video. With AI, we're now using Google for answer-based solutions, not search-based solutions. When someone presses play on your podcast, they are choosing to spend time with you. Sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. And that's something very few marketing channels can offer. Your audience is hearing your voice, your personality, your perspective. And over time, that builds a relationship, which is why podcast listeners often become your most loyal customers. They feel like they know you, they trust you, and trust drives business. So the next time that you are looking at your podcast analytics, please remember this. Downloads are only a small piece of the puzzle. They don't measure the relationships that you're building. They don't measure the trust that you're creating. And they definitely don't measure business opportunities that can come from your podcast. Instead of asking whether your numbers are big enough, ask yourself a better question. Are the right people listening? Because if they are, your podcast is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. And if you're thinking about starting a podcast or you want to use your existing podcast more strategically for your business, that's exactly what we do here at Next Step Social. From launching your show to producing episodes to turning one podcast into an entire content strategy. You can learn more at nextstepsocial.com. And before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one question. If your ideal client could spend 20 minutes with you every week, listening to your ideas, learning from your expertise, how would that change your business? Because that is the real power of podcasting. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of Rocky Mountain Marketing. I hope you're leaving with valuable insights and the inspiration to lead your market. If you've enjoyed our time together and found today's podcast episode useful, I have a small favor to ask of you. Please hit that subscribe button to stay updated with the latest episodes. And if you know someone who could benefit from these episodes, maybe a fellow business leader or an aspiring entrepreneur, go ahead and share this episode with them. Let's spread the knowledge and grow together. Also, I'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation beyond the podcast. Visit me at katiebrinkley.com to connect, to find more resources, or just to share your journey. And be sure to pick up your copy of my new book, The Social Shift, at katiebrinkley.com/book. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm Katie Brinkley, and I can't wait to dive into more strategies and stories with you on the next episode of Rocky Mountain Marketing. Let's keep on taking your marketing to new heights.